This is a short and brief overview of Chapter 2. Chapter 2 um, goes into traditional definitions of counseling, traditional definitions of treatment, traditional definitions of um, how we view our work with other individuals, or how we have viewed our work with other individuals, considering or not considering cultural diversity and perspective. Traditionally, we haven't done a great job of this. It is now required that you take courses in multicultural counseling, and that multicultural competencies be integrated into all of your courses so that you can get even just the foundation, or sort of the sort of entry level perspective in why this is important. Your book has this great write up from Dr. D, they call him Dr. D, and his work with a Latina American client named Gabriella. And in the write up from Dr. D, he talks about his stance, or his position of viewing her through this culturally universal way of viewing her panic attacks. So he feels, she describes panic attacks. I don't know if she even uses that word. She just talks about sort of the symptoms, but she talks about the symptomatology, and he assigns panic attack to it. She has a very different word, and he doesn't stop to ask what that word is. And he assigns panic attack, and then in his mind, he has decided and created that she has panic attacks, and that panic attacks are universal across all cultures. As opposed to asking her, what does this mean for you? What does this look like for you? And how is this described within your culture? What does this word mean? So that assumption, and that just sort of broad definition of what his client was experiencing speaks to cultural universality formulation of his view of his client, versus the cultural relativism, or more they discuss in your book, cultural specific, or emic formulation of how to view a client, or how to work with a client. So cultural relativism talks about those specific differences within a culture that may or may not exist in the definition of the majority culture. So what I mean by that is, this chapter goes into describing the DSM and a lot of treatment options, treatment assessment tools, not treatment, assessment tools that are developed by the majority group. So white Americans, and oftentimes primarily white males, sort of develop the way that we define and view mental health issues, mental health concerns, and oftentimes even the way that we are supposed to relate to individuals of diverse groups, which is pretty interesting and ironic, don't you think? And so we do ourselves and our clients a disservice when we apply this broad and generalized view of what these symptoms mean to everybody. So again, if I assume that depression looks exactly the same across all cultures and all diverse groups, then I'm applying my worldview to you. I'm applying what is marginally normed, if you will. That's not even accurate, but marginally created for all group members. I'm doing my client a disservice to assume that it applies to diverse group members. And we know this, and your DSM does go into, a great bit of detail to describe working from clients considering their diverse makeup, but it's hard to do so when they have been created by the majority group. Cultural universality and culturally specific formulations is so important that I wanted to spend this much time on it. And I think it's really important to know that it's just really important to know that we cannot generalize these broad definitions to diverse group members. So let's see. This goes on. So this goes on to even further describe what we're talking about. What is distress in your culture? What does distress look like in your in your group? What does that look like? How is it defined? Um, and what theory are you coming from? Does your theory support defining a client, or sort of, for lack of a better word, positioning a client through this universal worldview or lens? What we know is that most culturally or multiculturally competent counselors operate somewhere in the middle. On both extremes, on both ends, it's too extreme. If you are only applying this universal formulation to clients, or universal orientation to a client, or you are only applying this specific formulation, you miss bits and pieces. And as human beings, we exist alone and we exist with others. And so to appropriately and effectively and ethically counsel, we have to consider the alone individual and the group individual. And that alone individual has so many piecey parts to it, and the group individual has so many piecey parts to it. I hope that makes a lot of sense, and I hope I'm, appropriately supporting what you're reading in this chapter. Let's see, kind of going through this book and wanting to make sure that we pick out what's really important. I wanted to stop for a moment and look at this, and I really like this. I really like on page 48, I really, really, really appreciate the quote, this old Asian saying that they put in: all individuals in many respects are like no other individuals, like some individuals, and like all other individuals. So we're not like anyone. We are like others, and we are like all others. And so they have this graph here, this image, or this figure rather, and it separates the three levels of how we can, how we are like others, how we're not like others, and how we're like some others. And if you sort of start in the center, so I think that's it, when your book describes it, it starts in the center and works out this individual level, then going to group level, and then going to that universal level. And again, how we're like nobody else, that's the individual level. We have those genetic individual components to us, and we have those experiences that not one other single person in the world could potentially ever have, even if it's a similar experience. Let's say in the case of sexual assault, while other individuals may experience sexual assault, that sexual assault will never be the same as anyone other's experience. And so there's a variety and a multitude of how many ways that those non-shared experiences can be expressed. And I think from the moment we are conceived, we have non-shared experiences. Literally down to the amniotic fluid that we are swimming around in. Even if you have siblings, the amniotic fluid that you are swimming around in is very different than the amniotic fluid of your siblings. I hope that doesn't gross anyone out that I use that as an example, but we are we have so many very different experiences from the moment we are even thought of. So moving into those group level similarities and differences. So again, we're starting in the center and kind of moving out. And so if we look at how we are the same in some respects and same as different than others, the graph describes in a variety of ways that you are. Your disability and marital status may be the same as others, but then your religious preference and geographic location may be very different. And even, this is just examples of different similarities and differences. And then let's see, is there anything else here? And I think what's important to say here is those similarities and those differences can create unique group situations for us. Your book uses the example of disability, similarities in disability may create group cohesiveness, regardless of what your gender or sexual orientation may be. Your gender and sexual orientation, or your gender and your sexual orientation, may also create group similarities where you have all these other unique differences. And then moving out even further, that universal level, so we all have the ability to communicate in some way, shape, or form. We all have life experiences. So what does that mean? We all are born. We all die. We all love. We all experience sadness. I believe your book goes into talk about these sorts of things. And that's all similar. So regardless of those differences, we all share these bits. And then, we have our biological and physical makeup. Those are going to be vastly different, but we do have a very similar biological and physical makeup. And then self-awareness, the idea that regardless of your sort of spiritual or religious connection, we all have the capacity and the desire to sort of think about us and to sort of want to think about ourselves and think about ourselves in relation to others. That is a common factor. How we do that is very different. I think that's important to mention. So this just kind of goes into more, like I said, the universal and those group levels. This section or this chapter talks about those multicultural competencies. And I like that on page 54, it has this wonderful definition. And I'm not going to read it, but I want you to read it. So just describing what is multicultural counseling. What is it like to be a therapist who considers the diversity of others and your awareness of your bias and your diversity? And so how can you utilize this to be an effective counselor? And you can see here that these components, there's 6 components here: the helping role in the process. Are you considering life experiences and cultural values? Do you consider those individual, group, and universal dimensions of existence and honor them? Are you universally applying assumptions and treatment options, or are you taking this cultural specific perspective, or are you doing a combination of both? Do you in your theory place importance on individualism or collectivism? Your theory may drive and inform some of these ideas you have, in addition to your morals, values, and beliefs doing so. And the client system. Some theories and perspectives assume that sort of the counseling relationship is, the counseling work is on the individual, and they don't assume the outside perspective of that individual, the family, the culture, the friends, the group makeup. What does your theory say? Does your theory support independence and autonomy in that counseling session, or does it consider the system of the client? This is where I'm going to end when it comes to chapter 2. So the competencies talk about your awareness of one's assumptions, values, and biases. Are you aware of the assumptions that you make, consciously or otherwise? Do you make assumptions without even thinking? Are these assumptions correct? Your values, what drives your value system, and your biases. What are you bringing to the room that's going to hurt your relationship with that client? Are you taking every effort to understand the worldview of your client and their diversity, their ethnic makeup, their racial diversity, their cultural diversity, their subculture, their system? Are you being culturally competent in trying to understand their worldview, or are you just taking your perspective? And are you appropriately looking at interventions and techniques and strategies and even theories that support being culturally appropriate? And that's really important. We talked about that a little with the DSM. We'll talk about this more, but that's just a synopsis of chapter 2.